We continue our discussion on marriage by now talking about marriage rules. As I mentioned earlier, there are still societies where marriage is arranged. People's families will make the choice, they make alliances sometimes very early on, either when a child is born or before the child is born or much later. And some people will sometimes kind of wonder why people would agree to an arranged marriage. But in a lot of cultures, if you talk to people who are in arranged marriages, they will tell you that they think that the choosing of a mate is an important thing, and it's so important that they alone can't do it. And they rely upon and welcome the wisdom of their family, people who have lived much longer than they have, to make those choices. Also, very often, people who are in arranged marriages will tell you, while in the beginning, this idea of love that very often we're familiar with in the West, that over time they learn to love their partner in the same way that people in cultures such as the United States embrace the idea of love being the beginning of marriage. There is the practice of exogamy, which is seeking a spouse outside of one's own group, and that's contrasted with endogamy. That's where people marry individuals from the same group. And again, when we talk about that, very often the idea of exogamy or seeking a spouse outside of one's group is a place where individuals look for people outside of their immediate families. The incest taboo having something to do with that or being a factor in that idea. When we look at endogamy, we said again that it was marriage of people from the same group. And as a part of that is the practice of homogamy, which is a part of that. And that's where people marry someone that is of a similar status. It's often a question or a matter of access. If you think about it for a moment, people who are alike in terms of their background, social status, social economic status, all of those things are very likely to be in environments where they encounter people who are very much like them. An example I always like to use, if you look at people who are among the super rich or very wealthy in the United States, those individuals tend to live in the same areas, go to the same schools, belong to the same social organizations, and that kind of thing, and typically are going to marry amongst other people in that group. The things that we see in movies oftentimes where you have a very wealthy person who meets the quote unquote commoner or a person without all of those resources, and they fall in love and marry and all of the things that go in that. That's one of the reasons why it's so often a subject of movies and television shows and books, because primarily most people end up practicing homogamy, where they marry someone very similar to their own background. Within caste systems, which are extreme examples of endogamy, that's where a person can only marry another person in their caste, and there is not an opportunity for them to marry outside of the caste. And in the US, um, the idea of races, when we talk about that, while we know that race is a cultural construct, still there are many ways in which race over the years has functioned just like a caste system. And we know that there were laws once on the books in the United States that prohibited people from uh, different races to marry. I talked just a moment ago about how the incest taboo and exogamy work together. Incest is having sexual relationships with a close relative. The Incest taboo is another cultural universal that all cultures have rules in their societies that prohibit having sexual relations with a close relative. However, what constitutes incest varies from culture to culture. What a lot of people are surprised to find, for example, that in many cultures, the cousin marriages are quite common. There are what we term cross cousins. Cross cousins are children of siblings of the opposite sex. For example, your father's sister's children in many cultures would be your cross cousins. Oftentimes, they would be eligible for marriage partners. Oftentimes, they might be the preferred marriage partners. There are also what are known as parallel cousins. And again, these may be children of the siblings of the same sex. Again, your mother's sister's children would be your parallel cousins. And again, in some cases, those might be the preferred partners or people who are eligible for marriage. But it varies from culture to culture. But in almost all cultures, when we talk about the incest taboo, sexual relations between a parent and a child, and very often between a brother and a sister. While there have been periods in history in certain groups where brother and sister marriage has been common in very small groups, but almost always sexual relations between a parent and child has been prohibited. What happens in the case of a spouse dying? There are some durable alliances in cultures that speak to this. The first is the Levirate marriage, where the man assumes responsibility for his dead brother's widow and children. And then there's the sororate marriage or custom, where the widower marries the female relative of his deceased wife, again in this case to take care of the children. In both of these cases, the primary concern is to take care of children, and oftentimes it is also to take care of the surviving spouse, particularly in some societies where a woman, without having belonging or having a connection with a man, it makes things very, very difficult. Widows have a very difficult time in a lot of communities, and these alliances often help to address those issues. So we turn to the question of how many spouses can a person have? And you probably know already this can vary from culture to culture. There's the idea of monogamy. That's where a person is allowed one spouse. In countries like the United States, what we technically practice is serial monogamy, and that's a person having one spouse at a time. There are some cultures where a person can only be married one time, but in the United States, if a person's spouse dies, they may choose to marry again, or in the case of divorce, they may also remarry. There's also the umbrella term polygamy, which means plural spouses or more than one spouse. And under that are two instances. The first is polygyny, where that's a man can have more than one wife. He can have multiple wives. And then there is polyandry, where a woman is allowed to have multiple husbands. In your reading, the article When Brothers Take a Wife talks about polyandry, which a lot of people are not necessarily familiar with, but as the article or the reading points out, that polyandry very often involves land. This diagram shows where, in the case of a father, if we look over on the side of monogamy, where a father, the traditional custom would be that as each of his sons take wives, the property is split between them. And so in this case, if there are three brothers and they take three wives, each of them has a share of the land. They divide it up. And as you can see, the division of the land gets smaller and smaller as the number of wives and sons increases. On the other side, when in the case of polyandry, if brothers share a wife, then they all work together on that inherited land and they continue to pass it down to their other sons and wives, but their land is never divided up in the same way that it is in the situation of monogamy. And generally, polyandry takes place in areas where land is very scarce, and splitting it up becomes extremely problematic.